So today is our introduction to figure drawing. An idealized figure, or a figure that you might see in a Greek god or a comic book, they're 8 heads tall. A realistic person is only 7.5 heads tall.
Start by stacking 7.5 ovals on top of one another to symbolize the body. Now let's label what each head represents. Remember, the human figure, a realistic human figure, is only 7.5 heads, not 8. That first head ends at the bottom of the chin. The second ends at the sternum in the middle of your chest. The third ends at your belly button. The fourth ends at your pubis, the space in between your legs. The fifth is above the knee. The sixth is below the knee in the shin, not chin, excuse the typo. And the last is the ankle, and with that half a head being the feet. So let's flesh this out on an actual person. Go ahead and draw in your 7.5 heads again. Put in a neck. We'll give our little guy some shoulders here. Then going down into the chest area, into the belly button, filling that out. Putting the hips, adding in the top of the thigh, going down for the upper thigh, adding in the knee. Again, notice how I'm putting in all of those dots where the heads are to know that those are points of connection, and then filling out the other side. Let's talk about the arms. I'm going to add in the shoulders, and then it's important to know that your elbows fall around the third head. They fall in your belly button. So if you hit your elbows right now, they should hit your belly button, and your wrist should go down to your pubis. It's really important to know those two things because the arms are often either too long or too small. Two things to make a note of. The first is that the head is so much smaller than we think. The biggest mistake I see is making our heads big like a Bratz doll. And the second is that the body is much larger than we think. The head is just a small part. Now let's go ahead and talk about the hands and feet, another tricky area. So our hand, if you take your hand and you put it up to your face right now, you'll notice that the tip of your third finger should hit around your brow bone. So your hand is about 3/4 of the height of your head. And that's really important so that you don't draw really tiny hands that look like they don't belong to the body. Then the feet, even though they're only half when we're looking at a figure straight on, in the actual length, they are the same size as your head, or approximately. These are just general proportions, not hard, fast rules. So the third common mistake, and something to note, is that the hands and feet are often bigger than you think.
Doing figure drawing, we want to look at two things. We want to look at space and we want to look at shape. So as we're looking at a figure, we can see that there are different bends happening. Bends in the spine, bends on the vertical axis of the figure. And those shifts in weight are creating different negative shapes around the figure.
Go to a new page in your visual journal and write down the word space.
When you go to draw someone, you want to be looking for those negative shapes around the figure. By drawing and blocking in that space, you will be able to draw the figure more accurately. Just like in Art 1, when we were drawing still lives, we wanted to look at the space around the space that is being created in order to describe the positive space.
Try doing this for yourself in your visual journal. To be clear, this is not easy. This is tough. You really have to look closely and be as accurate as you can. If all goes well, the figure, or at least the general outline of the figure, should start to emerge from the negative and positive space. Pause this video, finish up your drawing, and resume when you're ready. So remember, the space step is all about looking at the space around the figure, otherwise known as the negative shapes. Go ahead and in the space below, try doing this next figure on your own. First we talked about space, and now we're going to talk about shape.
So it's a little overwhelming to draw an entire body because there are so many parts drawn in relation to one another, and that's why it's difficult. And so the best way to get a hold of those proportions and get used to drawing all those different body parts is to reduce them into basic structures or forms: spheres, cubes, cylinders, and cones.
These are really the building blocks of the human figure. And even if you become super advanced at figure drawing, it's always a good idea to start with basic forms and then build up into more detail. So I'm going to start with the head, a cylinder for the neck, making a cylinder form for the torso and for the hips. Also, again, a cylinder for the legs. Notice how I'm using those circles to finish the openings. Those openings are where the joints are. Anywhere where there's a bend in the body, you need to have some sort of end or connection. Cylinder again for the opening of the shoulder, putting in a sphere there for the shoulder joint, closing it off at the elbow and continuing in the wrist and in the hands. So we have our basic little robo person here. Make sure that you copy this diagram in your visual journal. If you need more time, pause and restart the video. Let's go back to our little friend here. So even though we're on the shape step, I still start with space, mapping out the general positive and negative space around the figure to define the figure. And only then do I start breaking it down into robo. Now I want to mention that every step of the way, if something looks wrong, try to fix it. So after you finish the space and you start going into shape and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't look right, don't just keep drawing. Erase, change, draw over. Constantly want to be drawing and redrawing. So I'm adding cylinders for his hips, longer cylinders for his legs, using spheres for the joints and the knees. Then more cylinders. I've broken down the feet in this case into triangles. You have options with what shapes that you choose, but I really find that cylinders work the best for most of the objects. And then moving up into the torso, doing a big oval here, and then adding more cylinders for the arms. Trying to be as precise as possible, really getting that body language. Something else that's useful about using geometric shapes is that sometimes if we just go into drawing a person, they look really lanky. And the more volume you can build up, the more roundness, the more convincing your figure drawing is going to be. So even though it seems silly to use shapes, the shapes are really where it's at. Pause and restart the video if you need more time. Next, it's your turn. Draw this woman, breaking her down into basic shapes. I provided some for you so you visually have them there.
As you're first marking her in with these shapes, be sure that you're looking at these negative shapes around her. These will guide you to tell you if her positioning is correct. Now we've talked about space, we've talked about shape, and now we're going to talk about form. So form has everything to do with volume. Just how we talk about in Art 1, shape is something flat and two-dimensional, and form is something that gives the illusion of being three-dimensional or illusionistic. So you want to look for the shadow shapes, for the major shadow shapes, and that will give you a realistic form.
So this yellow line here represents the shadow shape going down. Sometimes it's hard to see the shadow shape, but I've tried to choose images for this unit where you can see them pretty clearly. Either way, sometimes you have to make a judgment call and decide this is what the shape is going to be. But the shadow shapes should, unless the lighting is really irregular, follow the entire shape of the body. Running down here on the right, running down here on the left. We're not going to get too much into shading right now, but as you're going through the form step, you can shade using either hatching, so making lines that are parallel to one another, cross-hatching, doing the hatching but then going across to make an X shape,
or blending, which you're most familiar with, which is smooth shading. It's totally up to you which shading method you'd like to use. Even though we're working on form, I still need to go through space and shape. So blocking out the space that the figure is occupying with positive and negative shapes, then breaking down the figure into robo-man / woman using cylinders and spheres and really correcting those proportions. Only when my proportions look correct should you go into the form space, where you mark down the shadow shapes, being really definite and intentional about what those shadow shapes are, and then I'm just filling them in with some basic shading, nothing fancy. This drawing took me about 10 minutes, just for reference, even though I'm speeding it up. So go ahead and try for yourself, going through and drawing this figure using space, shape, and form. Go ahead and pause it, and then resume when you have finished. Let's try drawing this man in the space below the previous drawing that we just did. I'm going to keep my drawing in real time so you can see how long it actually takes to go through the 3 steps. I encourage you to draw with me. Remember not to copy what I'm doing, but use the video of me drawing as a way to inform how you approach this process. As you work through this drawing, if something looks funny, fix it. Use vertical lines to see where things are lining up. Use horizontal lines to see where things are lining up. Turn your drawing upside down. There are a lot of tools for you to check yourself. But at the end of the day, if something looks funny, it probably is. So try not to call it done until you feel fairly confident with what you have. If you do happen to finish before I finish my drawing, then go ahead and move on to part 2 of our figure drawing video series.